part of this new knowledge discovery is testing that discovery. So that's why you publish the paper and get slings and arrows thrown at it from your colleagues, and to prove that it is right. General relativity is still just a theory that could be proved wrong today, tomorrow, with a different test. All models of the universe, to a certain extent, are wrong. It's just a matter of when they are wrong. How useful is the model? So it would be really cool. I would be excited for the day where AI-based systems can help generate new discoveries that people would not have thought of. At the same time, you can't take new discoveries just at face value and say this is truth. Part of the scientific enterprise that any AI-based system, I believe, should be subjected to as well, is that verification process to prove that it's true.
And welcome back to another episode of the 100-Year Podcast. My name is Adario Strange, and this week we have with us a special guest who, I guess you can say, he traverses the worlds of space and artificial intelligence in his own way. Duncan Eddy, how are you? Thanks for joining.
Doing very well. It's a pleasure to be here, Adario.
And you are based in San Francisco?
Yep, correct. Based in San Francisco, currently working at Stanford University at the Center for AI Safety.
Okay, but you have like another role, aeronautics. Can you kind of like describe like what you're a PhD? I think you recently completed that, or somewhat recently.
A few years back. So my background is in aerospace engineering, in particular spacecraft operations. So started back at Stanford in 2013, was there for a few years. Ended up dropping out to join a startup in Palo Alto called Capella Space that was building the first U.S. radar Earth imaging satellites. So we were garage in Palo Alto with 10 people and was with them from our first satellite all the way up to having 10 satellites in orbit running their spacecraft operations group.
And then after that, I think you went to Amazon's initiative called Kuiper, Project Kuiper, which was, I guess, providing internet accessibility from satellites. Do I have that right?
Yep.
Okay.
So it was at Project Kuiper where we were building a constellation of proliferated low Earth orbiting satellites, very similar to Starlink for offering low cost, affordable internet globally. So partnering with Amazon devices and other Amazon initiatives to be able to provide accessible low cost terminals and efficient internet globally.
So I want to get into the whole AI part of our discussion, but first I want to I'm a bit of a space enthusiast. I want to get into some of the space stuff with you. First of all, I have to bring up Starlink. You mentioned Starlink, and I think one of the big concerns from, many people is the idea that we'll have, I don't know, for astronomers, let's just say, amateur astronomers, that the sky will be clouded with too many satellites, that there'll be, too much, traffic in the sky. My understanding, there's already a problem with space junk in terms of like debris or out of service space, satellites and various debris. And here Elon Musk launches this huge array. Starlink, and my understanding, I think you said 10 with Capella, right?
Yep.
And so, but I mean, Starlink, like, I'll just give you an example. I was talking to a friend the other day, and she's about to go on a cruise in Asia. And I said, "Oh, so you're going to be cut off from the world for a while?" She said, No. There's access. I said, "Well, how?" "Oh, well, on the site, on the website, on the cruise line website, we have access via Starlink." So I was like, "Oh, so this is mainstream. This is no longer, I'm, in the outback in Australia, or in, some part of Africa, in the Serengeti, and I'm using Starlink." This is now becoming kind of like a mainstream product. So it's moving quickly, but I'm just curious, like, do you, based on your experience, do you think there's a danger that we basically put too much in the sky?
So that's an open question right now. And there's a lot of the regulatory environment and the research environment trying to catch up with our understanding of what is too much, what is the capacity of low Earth orbit. That being said, I don't think that we're close to having too much. And I will say also, all of the major players who are launching these large constellations currently, so Starlink, OneWeb, Kuiper, are all very concerned about this problem because most of the people who, well, really all of the people who work in this industry are interested in space for space. It's a lot of passion, people who care a lot, and they are very interested in keeping it accessible for not just themselves, but also for future generations. So it's a problem that's taken quite seriously by the industry and the Starlink team have met them, talked with them. They're quite responsive to taking on the burden of some of what their operations do and their impact. And they have published a number of white papers in terms of some of their technical approaches to protecting the International Space Station. There have been impacts to astronomy. That's a noted concern, and it still is a challenge, and they have more work to do, especially with some of the new satellites that they're offering with direct-to-cell capabilities. There are also other players like AST Space Mobile that are launching incredibly large satellites that have had demonstrated impact to ground-based astronomy. And I mean, those players, I think, have an obligation to make sure that those impacts are mitigated.
My understanding is that the space station, the International Space Station, is set to be dismantled. Like, I'm curious your thoughts, as an industry player or previous industry player, like, why do you think this is happening? I mean, I'm sure like in terms of like kind of the backstory. Why is this happening? Do we need another one? Is this a problem that it's even being dismantled? And I think SpaceX actually has the contract to dismantle it.
Yeah, NASA just awarded last week or the week before the contract to build the deorbit capability for the space station. And I mean, it needs to be brought down at some point. It needs to be brought down safely. It is a very large object that will not entirely burn up. So it needs to have a controlled re-entry. That's actually a problem that you see in a lot of Chinese launches and Chinese space stations that have made the news in the past couple of years, where they've been doing uncontrolled re-entries where it isn't known where they will land. There's a lot of uncertainty that comes from Earth's atmosphere and drag where these objects will re-enter. And so one aspect of being a responsible operator is to bring down the objects that you launch in a responsible manner with a known area where it will land using a controlled re-entry. In terms of why people are bringing the space station down, there was an interesting paper from NASA released along with the contract award of why it needs to happen. And some of the challenges there include it's an old space station at this point. It's been operating for decades and decades and will continue to do it, with the core modules having been up there for 20 plus years at this point. And with that comes, you can't get in to clean everything. While they have procedures for making sure that everything is maintained and that it's a healthy environment, and it still is a closed environment. You're in a submarine in space, more or less. It has to be a self-contained environment with people living in it, and that creates challenges over time with age. I think there are challenges with what comes next after the space station. There's a lot of interesting and really good research that occurs there in terms of like crystal production. There's a lot of research in terms of how you make better semiconductors, biology as well, drug discovery. There are lots of good uses for having a space station. It's a point of cooperation as well. Even in the depths of the current war in Ukraine, the space station is still a point of collaboration between the US and Russia. It was throughout the entire Cold War as well, where there maintained lines of communication for the good of scientific exploration. So these types of efforts and initiatives provide a lot of good for the world. So it's important to have a plan, I think, for what comes next. Haven't really seen the support for the Artemis mission and what comes after for pushing to Mars that I would like to see out of the US Congress, but it's having a large mission and program like that is important for driving progress. And we've seen for every dollar in the space industry, 7 come back to people terrestrially. You have inventions like GPS, you have inventions like Velcro have come out of space programs. So things that produce a lot of value terrestrially are worth it. And so I think are worth the dollars invested.
So I'm wondering, in the context of like, I guess, international competition, so you mentioned kind of like, Russia, the war, and now I think, kind of relations, at least in the last few years with China and America, have cooled a bit. So it seems like I could see, the international station, maybe International Space Station continuing, but a new initiative seems like that might be a bit more difficult, particularly in the context of now there seems to be a new moon race. And, China is rushing to establish a base there. America has its own initiatives. Um, Mars seems, pretty ambitious for pretty much everyone, but the moon seems to be like the new kind of like, no, 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 we're going to claim. But I know that there are laws or like treaties, agreed upon treaties as to what you can and can't claim in space. I mean, are you keeping a tab on this whole moon race, as I call it? Like, do you think, do we, are we going to have a problem there? Like, you think something's afoot?
Uh, Problem, I don't think so, but I think competition is good. It makes people excited. It pushes people to do things that they haven't done before. In terms of congestion and resource claims, that is, there's 1960s UN Outer Space Treaty. There's the Artemis Accords that many countries have signed on to, and with statements of essentially protection for claims and uses. And space law is an emerging area of law. There's a lot of heritage from naval law and traditions that are brought into the domain. So it isn't totally unforged ground, but at the same time, it's a new area. I'm not a lawyer, so can't speak particularly to in-depth details, but it's distinctly a challenge. I mean, it's also exciting to see new countries. India recently had a lunar lander with great success. China has as well. Until recently, the US, and not just the US, JPL was the only organization and group of people in the world that had landed successfully on Mars. And so having more competition there, I think, is ultimately a good thing, because it ends up pushing everyone to accomplish things that they wouldn't have accomplished otherwise.
This makes me, and I'm sorry, please indulge me. I'm a science fiction guy. Have you watched For All Mankind, the series?
I have not, sadly.
Okay. All right.
I have heard it referenced many times that I should.
Okay.
But it sounds very excellent, actually.
Well, yeah, no, basically it is. And it kind of provides like an alternate history of space exploration where the Russians, I think, get to the moon first.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's been confirmed that it's a woman. Her name is Anastasia Belikova.
A former pilot in the Soviet Air Forces.
What a truly, truly historic moment for women watching across the world. The 32-year-old Soviet cosmonaut has become the first woman to set foot on the moon.
And it takes us into the future. It takes us into the past, an alternate past, then it takes us into an alternate future where we set up basically space stations or colonies on Mars. And the international, I guess, struggle between Russia, China, and America gets pretty intense. So I would just say, like, it's a great show to maybe watch just to see kind of like speculative fiction or science fiction to like see what might be possible in the future. I'm curious to go back to, I want to go back to Capella.
Yep.
Can you explain what synthetic aperture radar is? Can you like, for a layman, like what does that mean? Because that's what the company did and does. And I'm just curious, like, how does that differ from just traditional satellite imaging and,
Yep, most certainly. So excellent question. So the analogy that I use that might make some of my former radar scientist colleagues a little bit frustrated is it's like echolocation to a certain extent. If you have ever seen the Ben Affleck Daredevil movie or Batman, the Christopher Nolan Batman, essentially it's a different way of imaging. So where the satellite emits a pulse of light, generally an X-band about 8.6 gigahertz, and then waits for the response of that pulse to come back. And how the surface is shaped, the different materials on the surface will change what that reflection is. And by continuously doing that, as a satellite passes over a location, you can reconstruct an image of what that location looks like. So some of the challenges of traditional satellite imagery, so the optical imagery that you see on Google Maps, all of that imagery generally comes from either the Sentinel programs in the European Space Agency, the Landsat programs operated by NOAA, or a company called Maxar, actually out of Colorado. And all of that imagery is captured by optical imaging satellites, which have, and there are two problems if you're trying to get an update from space from somewhere around the world with optical imaging, which is half of the Earth is night and half of the Earth is clouds. So if you're trying to get an update of a new image of a location quickly, that can take a while if you're using an optical imaging satellite. You have locations in the Amazon, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia, where it can be really challenging to get a cloud-free picture of an event. And so that's where radar is incredibly, incredibly useful, is you can reconstruct something using this kind of echolocation reflected signal technique that looks a lot like a black and white image, but you can do that at night through clouds whenever. And so there's some really interesting applications that we worked on in terms of monitoring deforestation in the Amazon, where despite it being totally cloud free, totally cloud covered, you could take an image and see exactly where illegal deforestation and logging is going on. And so you can bring an eye and a spotlight to these types of applications. You can also look at illegal fishing. That's an excellent application because a metal boat on a calm ocean stands out like nothing in a radar image. So there are a lot of really interesting monitoring applications, as well as disaster response too.
And is that just focused on Earth? Meaning, can this also be used for, I don't know, meteor detection, foreign objects coming into the solar system, or is it just for Earth?
It's generally for Earth, like looking down. That being said, you can also use radar for other tracking applications. That's actually the main way we track space debris. Is there a network of radar sites operated by the U.S. government all around the world that look outwards? There's a commercial company, Leo Labs, as well in the Bay Area that operates radars globally that do the same thing looking outwards, more or less, and they track the objects that are in space. So this is one of the ways that actually companies, going back to one of the earlier points around collision avoidance, actually monitor for debris, make sure that things are safe, is that these networks of radar sites track all objects in orbit larger than about 10 centimeters and it's a free service that satellite operators subscribe to, collaborate on, and use to exchange information and messages about where their satellites are, where they are with relations to debris. There's notices, warnings, and collision avoidance procedures where satellite operators, if they get notified of a potential collision in the future, you can calculate it out days in advance, actually, and then take action to avoid those types of collisions.
I'm curious, back on the Amazon Kuiper project.
We have ignition and liftoff of the United Launch Alliance Atlas V rocket, carrying the proto-flight mission for Amazon's Project Kuiper.
Mach 1. Vehicle's now supersonic. Everything's looking good. We have exited the Earth's atmosphere.
Did they use Blue Origin to, kind of, I guess, facilitate satellite launches? Was that kind of separate? Like, was there any kind of... I understand that they're essentially separate companies, even though Bezos is the founder of both. But was there any kind of collaboration or no involvement at all?
So it's public information that in a large announcement recently that Kuiper had one of the largest rocket buys that has ever occurred. So purchasing from Arianespace, which recently had a successful Ariane 6 launch, which was incredibly fun to see. Apparently, Ariane didn't get the memo that you don't send a rocket up on the very first try, on the very first count. So it was a huge accomplishment by those teams. Really exciting to watch. But so Kuiper bought Ariane 6, Blue Origin, as well as Vulcan, as well, and the remaining Atlas rockets. So I'll also say I'm not a current representative of Amazon, and so am not representing the company there. But this is, very exciting in terms of the injection of capital, as well as funding the launch market and competition in the launch market as well. So we'll be excited to see when Blue Origin gets New Glenn on the pad and launching.
I want to move again. I want to move on to AI, but one last question. I want to get your thoughts on just this idea of private companies leading the space race versus governments, specifically, companies like Blue Origin, Elon Musk's SpaceX. It's easy to kind of answer, oh, well, they're both good methods to get to space. And, it's good that we have a lot of activity. But I'm really curious, do you think it's less than optimal that governments seem to be pulling back compared to the aggressiveness of some of these private space operations? Not pulling back, but maybe not as aggressive as they could be versus past initiatives.
I think there's a role for both. And we've seen like the rise of SpaceX is as a space enthusiast has been incredibly exciting to see, to inject new ways of building space systems. The government is incredibly challenged in many ways, I think, in terms of how they approach missions, because it's taxpayer dollars. And so the missions that they take on, James Webb, incredibly exciting, incredibly cool, but a 20-year program that can't fail, essentially, because of the amount of money invested, which makes it incredibly risk averse and much slower. Whereas for commercial companies, they can have a different risk profile. And what SpaceX has demonstrated is that even for complex hardware engineering projects, that a fail fast, fail early approach can be incredibly successful, where it's actually okay to have your rockets blow up. It's okay to have failures if you learn from them and learn from them quickly, because the time that you save trying to validate a complex deployment, a complex system on the ground, building exquisite test devices, trying to mimic conditions on orbit, you can also get those learnings by just launching the rocket. And yes, that might cost a lot of money when it fails, but at the same time, you move much more quickly and you save money in the long run from the ongoing operational costs of what it takes to run those test facilities, pay your engineers, all of that work. So at the same time, having a totally carefree commercial industry, that isn't necessarily great either. So NASA they partnered extensively with NASA for the Commercial Crew program, where they were the oversight body, making sure that SpaceX, for all of their commercial entity program, was building a safe and reliable system. In the same way that commercial air travel is, like, planes are built by commercial companies. They're overseen by the FAA, and flying is the safest way to travel by a long margin. So I think there's role for a partnership there. And also, by having commercial companies step in traditionally roles that NASA has done in terms of getting mass into orbit for replacing the space shuttle, even landing on the moon with the commercial lunar program, where Intuitive Machines just had a successful launch. Some of those programs that cost NASA a lot of money to develop the initial test and demonstration of, commercial companies can start to fill in, can offer those services at a lower cost, and then free up NASA to work on more cutting-edge, challenging missions that don't necessarily have commercial interest, but could provide long-term commercial benefits if proven out. So NASA can take on more of a technology development role. There's some really cool ideas for missions of going to Europa and looking at and some of the icy moons out there in the deep solar system, for looking for life in water or otherwise. And so there isn't a immediate commercial application for that, but that's a role that NASA can take on and develop and figure out ways that we can get out there.
Is there life on Europa?
We don't know. That's the very...
But there are hints, right? Aren't there hints that there's life on Europa?
I mean, there are signs, there's possibilities in terms of having potentially tectonic gravitational activity deep in the core of the moon that would generate heat, which could present possibilities of liquid water deep in the planet. I might be best speaking here, since I'm not super deep on my outer space.
No, just figured I'd ask. Because I rarely hear Europa, so whenever I hear Europa from someone who knows their stuff, I have to ask. I'm curious. Let's kind of like shift into AI mode here, but keep one foot in space. Do you think this idea of space travel that is often, I guess, dramatized, depicted in films of humans traveling, warp speed, or Interstellar has its own take, and all these different ideas. From my vantage point, it seems like it's far more likely in the future that we will send AIs, robots, empowered or embedded with AIs, into space to do deep space exploration. So, do you think I saw you nodding. So do you think that's our future? Do you think we have any future in terms of us as meat bags, in space? Or is it mostly going to, or we still haven't admitted that we will mostly send AI robots into space?
I think you're onto something, and it is highly likely that the first explorers, the first agents out there representing humanity, will be robotic, AI agents. So not necessarily intelligent, but will be autonomous decision makers just because of the inherent challenges to space exploration. When you are 7 minutes, 20 minutes of communication time away, you can't be waiting for the command and control operator in a mission control center on Earth to say yes and press the button for every next command. To get down into undersea oceans and outer moons, there's no getting that communication back with at least the technology we have now. And so you need to have intelligent decision-making agents. That's actually some of the work that the lab that I'm at works on currently, is how do we build some of these autonomous decision-making agents to explore other environments? And how do you build them to be able to robustly and safely traverse new environments where they might not have seen? You might discover a new type of rock that doesn't exist on Earth. You might see a new sea. We don't know what's there. And that's one of the large challenges in AI currently, is how does it generalize to unknown environments? A lot of the time we see it generalized poorly, but how do you make safe, robust systems that can handle these new environments and explore where people otherwise couldn't? I think people will always have the lust for exploration. So I think there will always be a push to get people out there eventually, but it's for especially like out of solar system, those first explorations I think are going to be robotic in nature just because of the timelines involved and the unfortunately relatively short human lifespans.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going to pull you back into science fiction again. A few years ago, not a few, like 6-7 years ago, I wrote a short science fiction story. And the idea was, it was basically about AI systems here on Earth. But the system rapidly figured out, okay, the way we basically, as a hive mind, take over this planet and kind of like have free reign is through satellites. And so they quickly, basically infected the satellite systems all across the Earth and created this lattice of control. And that's kind of where the story kind of ends / kicks off into a greater story. Do you think that's something that could ever really happen, like in the far future? Is that kind of like too fantastical, or does that have any root in possibility, at least in a generalized sense, not imminently?
I mean, in a general sense, computer systems are vulnerable to cyber attack. So could potentially be a threat? Actually, there was, in the last couple of years, the White House issued something called Space Policy Directive 5, which is a direction to all space operating companies and agencies to harden the cybersecurity of space-based assets, as well as the terrestrial services that operate them. And so with, artificial intelligence, automatic code generation, we've seen it both enhance how threats can be generated as well as how threats can be responded to on both sides. So there is, you can't rule out the possibility of a large-scale threat discovery, threat attack, threat execution across these systems. That being said, that I would say that is more science fiction now than it is a real-world possibility. But it's important. Cybersecurity and the history of security is always new threats emerge, new defenses emerge. So it's always something to be aware of and continue working on the solutions.
Good answer. On that point, it's been a couple of months since Congress, a bipartisan group in Congress, basically released a proposal where they are looking for $32 billion directed toward AI safety. We've also, on this show, we have frequently shown experts from entertainment, technology, various disciplines speaking to Congress about AI and the implications. I'm just curious, like, are you keeping, are you following what's happening in Washington, D.C. With regard to possible legislation? I guess what they want, like what do you think they're even thinking about doing with this $32 billion? I'm sure, they've packed in, the government likes to pack in 800 different little initiatives and, this has something very tangentially to do with our original idea, but it's good. So let's just pack it in. But in general, like, what do you think this 32 billion might be for? Even if you haven't read their full initiative, I'm just curious your I guess perspective on the US government devoting this much attention and now, I guess, financial resources toward AI safety.
mean, I think it's a helpful thing to invest in, since we've seen great success with AI-based tools compared to classical techniques. So self-driving cars are a great example, right? It's a new technology that I can walk outside and hail a Waymo right now, which is super cool. At the same time, classical control theory has a lot of guarantees and proofs behind it that make sure that we know that systems are safe. They're used extensively on planes, for example. When you rudder up, rudder down, we know how those systems will respond and can make statements about safety and how those systems will respond to define what safe is. So that with a known set of inputs, you get a known set of outputs. It is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, right now, depending on how large the system is, to make similar statements about AI-based systems. That's one of the things that the Center for AI Safety that I work for now extensively focuses on, is how do we build those new types of tools, techniques, algorithms, software proofs to provide safety methods, formal verification, assessment techniques for AI safety. So those are the types of where we need further investment in. And so I would think and hope that new congressional bill and initiative would go to funding the research in those areas to help address that kind of research gap that exists currently.
Yeah, I have to admit, usually I think the government moves very, slowly, but I think they're the speed with which they are responding to AI in general, not just safety, but just the rules around, the models and copyright and all this. It's all very encouraging, because usually, with the internet, it took forever, even though the internet, in many ways was born of, government initiatives. It took forever to get action on that on a governmental level. So it's kind of encouraging. You mentioned the Center for AI Safety at Stanford. Can you explain what is, I think I'm saying it, ReluPlex? The algorithm.
Yeah.
You guys developed an algorithm devoted to, I guess, checking for safety parameters in AI models. Is that
yes
a general?
Yeah, so it's some really interesting research out of two professors, Clark Barrett and Michael Kokendorfer's groups, and some of their graduate students, which provides what I was talking about earlier in terms of formal verification methods for AI-based systems. So I'll go back a little bit and talk about control theory to kind of explain what ReluPlex does. So in the coolness of the advancement. And so classical control theory is the problem of how do you want to accomplish something, set your thermostat to a specific temperature, have your cruise control go at a specific speed, 80 miles an hour, or let's say 65. And so what are the sets of inputs that get your system, your car, your water heater or boiler to achieve that given reference? And so classical control theory, which is mathematical techniques, can solve that problem. And you can make statements about how, based on a given set of inputs, your system will respond. How much will you overshoot on temperature? Or how much will you overshoot on speed? How long will it take you to get within a certain range of your desired temperature or range? And it can also make statements about the robustness. So no water boiler is the exact same as the one you write down the mathematical model for. Your car as manufactured isn't some ideal engineering version of a car. There's differences in the manufacturing tolerances, the suspension, the springs in the engine. And so you can also, through something called robust control, make statements of, even if our system is 20% off from our ideal model, we'll still stay within 30% error on our ideal reference for the input. So you can make statements around, based on a given set of inputs, how the system will respond, and guarantee as well over an entire possible range of inputs that your outputs will stay in a certain range. So one of the problems, going back to AI-based systems and ReluPlex, is neural networks are nonlinear systems. They are deeply complex. People can't effectively reason over them. So we need automated tools to essentially provide the same function of saying, for a given set of inputs, what are the possible ranges of outputs? A pretty famous and well-known example is single pixel attacks in image recognition, where you can take an image that looks, for a person, like a panda bear or something, and change one pixel of content in it, And an AI-based recognition system will then start saying it's a plane or it's a bird or something totally different, which is an example of, even for a known set of inputs, you have wildly different and unexpected outputs. So when you start to apply neural networks to control theory, say you want to change out your cruise control for a neural network, why you would do that when you can solve the problem well classically? You shouldn't, is the answer. But say that you want to, how can you provide similar statements of safety? So for a known set of inputs, how do we say that our neural network over all possible inputs will have a known bounded set of outputs? So you know that it won't do anything like wildly accelerate, that it won't do anything that you don't expect. So ReLUplex is a way of solving that problem. For a specific class of neural networks, it applies a set of algorithmic techniques that verify properties of the neural network. So you can start to reason and talk about these AI-based systems, these neural networks, and say, for a given set of inputs, I know I have proved formally that the outputs will stay bounded in a certain range, which is ways of starting to prove safety.
So I'm probably out of my depth here when I mention this, but we had a previous guest on a couple of times, Professor Pedro Domingos, and he mentions often this idea of objective function. And it sounds like, to some degree, that this is similar to it sounds, at least to me as a layperson, similar to what you described in terms of kind of like a traffic cop almost in these AI models. And I'm just curious, like, is ReLUplex, if I'm saying it correctly, is it more the idea that it is an outside algorithm that is kind of checking versus this internal check that might be biased toward, the organization or the company? Is that?
It's more of the former, right? It's an outside check on a system where you do validation. You can treat the system under test more as a black box, that you are handed a neural network. You don't really know what's inside of it, but you want to test it to find out how it behaves and make statements around its properties. So in terms of the objective function, a neural network would be trained with respect to some objective function. Generally, minimizing loss is the main one. And so that type of, there's the objective function shaping that Pedro Domingos has talked about. But then say you want to make statements about, and you've trained your neural network, you then want to make statements of how it behaves, about its inputs and outputs. And so you would apply something like an external formal verification tool like ReLUplex to a system under test to then be able to verify properties. So it might be some type of, in the future, you could talk about verification of safety for deployment of AI-based systems, where, say, a new company is developing a self-driving car that has a neural network controller. How does the NTSB make sure it's safe? Well, they can start to say, well, you need to formally verify that neural network. You need to prove that for all of these inputs, that it has all of these expected outputs. And the NTSB doesn't need to look into the system itself. They just need to be able to apply test tools to verify that it behaves as expected. So it's an auditing mechanism.
Okay, great. So I want to kind of maybe rewind a bit and just talk about kind of the safety org in general. This is from the white paper on the website. This is the quote from the white paper: "We are currently unable to reason about AI systems. Indeed, we understand quite well the algorithms used for training them. This topic has been studied extensively, but given a trained AI system, we have no way to make rigorous claims about its behavior." Then further down, the white paper says, "The mission of the Stanford Center for AI Safety is to develop rigorous techniques for building safe and trustworthy AI systems, establishing confidence in their behavior and robustness, thereby facilitating their successful adoption in society." So the reason I wanted to read that is because what I see now increasingly is a lot of skepticism, particularly from the tech space, founders, startup people, with regard to any hand wringing or publicly voiced concerns about AI. So I kind of wanted to kind of just state the mission statement of what Stanford is doing on that. What is your view? Is that skepticism? And this is not, I'm not speaking about Stanford Center for AI Safety. I'm speaking about various initiatives now coming from universities, nonprofit groups. Is the skepticism warranted from the tech community that maybe these organizations are simply attempting to exert undue control or perhaps stifle an industry just as it's about to flower into this exciting new thing. Like, what are your thoughts about just like the skepticism from within, I guess, Silicon Valley? And you're in San Francisco, so I'm sure you're hearing a little bit of the chatter.
Yeah, it's excellent question. So as I've talked about previously, the mission of the center is closing that gap. And even in the statement of there aren't ways that we can reason about the safety of AI-based systems, well, you brought up ReluPlex, which is actually the center has developed, and the researchers associated with the center have developed a new way that we can reason about the safety of AI-based systems, which is really cool and excellent. And I would even think that it's the mission of the center itself is more about the technical development than the regulatory or policy front. We are really concerned with how, at least the work that I'm doing, the work that I've worked with other professors on, is about how we can build techniques to provide safety guarantees. And we have corporate sponsors and affiliates that see the value in that work and partner with us to develop new verification methods for their tools and systems. You don't want to be a self-driving car company that has accidents, because that would inhibit your ability to deploy your system to be commercially successful, to serve people. So even though there is the possibility for overregulation, I think that is a challenge that we see, and there's the possibility for knee-jerk reactions of governments that regulate the training or the technology. You can't necessarily regulate statistics, math, and linear algebra, matrix multiplication. You can regulate applications, though. And so that, I think, is potentially a valuable path to go down. But for Silicon Valley and for the techniques that we build in the center, I see a really great potential for partnerships there, where it's possible to how everyone can win. We can start to provide techniques, tools to build the public's confidence in these types of AI-based systems, where there is skepticism, there is doubt about, are they safe? What's the behaviors? What are the properties? Well, we don't have as many tools as we would like, and so that's what the center is working on, building tools so that everyone can be more confident in AI-based systems. We can make statements, we can make properties, we can make guarantees about how they behave, and so they become safer for everyone, and we can solve new problems with AI-based systems. For all of the challenges they presented, they've also presented amazing solutions.
Let me play devil's advocate a bit. So let's say you have a founder who thinks, well, all of these, nonprofits and university affiliated organizations attempting to address these AI safety problems, and maybe some of them have government influence or government ties, and they are maybe at some point actually able to exert like their influence and get some of these guardrails or safety procedures, protocols, as rules somehow in the U.S. But you have China, Russia, various other countries aggressively moving into AI. So playing devil's advocate purely, just what say you to someone who would, ask you like, well, wouldn't we kind of be tying one hand behind our back while these other nations are moving very quickly into the future of artificial intelligence?
So I think the important thing there is life is, ranges of gray areas. It isn't just black and white of no regulation and entirely, both hands tied behind our back competing with China and Russia. There needs to be a happy medium, and that's where the discussion needs to occur around what are reasonable protection systems in place. Andrew Ng, professor at Stanford, who taught the machine learning class for many, many years, has recently been writing about this in his newsletter as well, in terms of the value of regulating applications, but not necessarily regulating the underlying technology itself, the mathematics otherwise, because people need to be able to innovate. They need to be able to research, and they will, as you said. Like, you can't regulate understandings of math, of fundamental concepts, of computer chips. Like, the cat is out of the bag on computer chips. Yes, you could regulate how many, GPUs are deployed, other things like that. That ends up even kind of being challenging in and of itself for different reasons, but it is useful to put together, I think, regulations around different applications. Should we have, deep fake technology that is hosted by US companies? Probably not. Like, that can be incredibly damaging. Yes, it could be deployed against US citizens, influence media, influence personnel. That's where we can invest in research. How do we detect these types of fakes? How do we do it otherwise? And this gets back to the cybersecurity arms race.
How much do you think ethics are a part of this discussion? Meaning, okay, we know about the levers and, binary system, just we know about all the technology and what you can do with algorithms. But at some point, the human element comes into play. Decisions as to what these systems can and can't do and what their goals are come from humans. So, like, I feel like that's less discussed when we talk about AI. Like, what's the importance of that, if at all, in your view?
I think it's incredibly massively important. Any researcher or engineer has a responsibility for the systems that they create. This is some of the work that we do at the center. We bring in outside speakers to talk about the impact of the system, the impact of AI systems, of different ethical concerns to help educate the researchers associated with the center and otherwise. Because we're training the next generation of AI engineers that are going out into the world to build systems. And if we want to build fair, responsible systems, those need to be design considerations that go in. Unfortunately, we do see in systems, I was talking to an external group last week around the potential harms of AI-based systems to LGBT communities, where because especially in mental health diagnosis, where there's a lot of potential for good for people, there's more need than ever before for good mental health resources. AI can potentially fill some of those gaps with large language models and otherwise, but at the same time, so much of the data is very heteronormative that it can be harmful to marginalized communities and otherwise if not taken into consideration when these systems are designed. So it is a responsibility of the people building the systems to make sure that they are ethical, fair, and reasonable. And so that's where it's a responsibility for everyone to have discussions around what are the values? How do we develop these systems? How do we make them more fair, more ethical for everyone?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. Whenever I use a tool like, let's say, ChatGPT from OpenAI, it's fascinating to use it in different contexts. Meaning, if I am asking it a question about something I have no subject matter expertise or research background in, I just take the answer and maybe I'll interrogate the answer a bit and kind of come at it from a couple of angles to see if I get like the best answer possible. And I go with that answer. But if it's something I know about deeply that I've spent my entire career, working on or researching, I can quickly tell that it's giving me BS. I can tell that it's just parsing the web, crawling websites and regurgitating things that are simply not true. And I think that was kind of like my aha moment where I realized, okay, some, I guess, AI safety fear skeptics, meaning people who think we don't need to be worried so much about AI, in the future, they often frame it as a mere tool. And that my aha moment was when I started interrogating ChatGPT about things that I know a lot about and saw the, often weak answers or sometimes flat out incorrect answers. But that leads me to the next question, which is, I guess, to some degree, connected to the ethics question, which is superintelligence. So right now, AI is a mere tool. It seems to me in my various conversations with AI researchers, AI startup founders, some believe that this is absolutely going to happen. Some very soon. They think it will happen very soon. Some think this is kind of like science fiction, claptrap, as they say in the old Westerns. That this is it's just a tool. It will always be a tool, and AI will only ever be capable of what we allow it to be capable of doing. What are your thoughts on superintelligence and and if you do believe in, that we will at some point, and again, superintelligence being basically an AI that has its own sense of self and makes decisions on its own. Do you think that is in the offing in the future? And if so, do we need do we need to, and how can we stop it from basically saying, okay, well, you're the new ants, humans, and here's what we're going to do now. Super intelligence.
Yeah, excellent question. I think it's impossible. the future is long, and I think it's impossible in the future of humanity to rule out that as a possibility of something being possible. And so the question of how do we make sure that it doesn't go full Skynet on us and make your science fiction story become a reality, that I don't know of anyone that has any answers to that right now for how we do it. At the same time, I don't think we know how to make superintelligence either. That the current, as you mentioned, with large language models as a tool, they aren't reasoning right now for the techniques that we have. And I don't think anyone really has a full understanding, at least to my knowledge, of what makes intelligence, what makes consciousness. People have ideas, but no technology that we have today that I know of is going to have that aha moment for suddenly you have Skynet. And so, but until we can understand what makes intelligence, how can we also reason about it, making it safe and make sure it doesn't, make Terminator reality and the new Skull Mountain, the new hot real estate property. Well,
let me interject. Like, I guess, let me bring up the Turing test now. Many people feel systems passed the Turing test long ago. And it occurs to me that, when we think about science fiction, the idea is that it is this almost conscious machine that has its own personality. And my thought is that we would just need something that mimics consciousness enough, that makes someone think. And this is kind of like, the kind of referring back to the Turing test. If we had superintelligence that just seemed good enough, or seemed like maybe it could be conscious, even if it wasn't, like, what about that? Like, what, because that's kind of like, that seems fairly doable, like that, like something that mimics, an aware, self-possessed being.
Yeah. I mean, as you said, like, language models right now are quite impressive. They can mimic conversation, they can mimic reasonable discussion, and that's where we get back to the discussion around the ethics of what you build and the responsibility there. To take a slightly different but extreme example, we could build a system today that looks at planes and automatically launches nuclear missiles. No one should build that system. That is a bad system to go off and build. And thankfully to date, we have people in the loop for all of those systems. And I know some of those individuals, they take those responsibilities incredibly, incredibly seriously. And so in the same way with building AI systems that can mimic intelligence, can act autonomously, that's where it becomes the responsibility of the designer, that even if it isn't fully independent, fully intelligent on its own, these are input-output systems that can be connected to other systems to build complex behaviors. And that's where it's on the engineer and the designer to make sure that it doesn't go off the rails, which is why it is important to develop safety techniques to begin with, so you can make guarantees when building these types of systems that they don't.
To your knowledge, is there kind of like a new Turing test for superintelligence, like some like agreed upon standard test that is kind of like, here it is, superintelligence, we've reached it?
Not that I am aware of. I mean, it's a constant area of research. There's some very interesting paper. There's a graduate student on Corel that is working on a responsible AI assessment, that how do you evaluate AI responsibility. There have been a couple of interesting papers come out recently of demonstrating that the current LLMs do very poor about reasoning about circles overlapping or lines crossing. And so that's one area of active research, is how do we measure? How do we quantify? What is the new Turing test? I don't know of a universally accepted standard for it, but there's always new research and coming up with new tests of how do we evaluate this.
So let me ask you a question about something that might be superintelligence adjacent in a way. Right now, I kind of like talked about ChatGPT, and kind of, if you are a domain expert, you can kind of immediately see through some of the answers that you're getting in terms of like, the quality or lack thereof. For me, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about superintelligence, but I do spend a lot of time thinking about, will AI systems reach a point where they can render answers we were unable to render ourselves? Meaning they're not just reference systems that, pour through our research and data and experiments and kind of spit out kind of like our already agreed upon conclusions. Like when we reach a point where AI systems can actually figure out something new about physics, figure out something new about, I don't know, the universe, medicine, our physiology. Do you see that near on the horizon?
I think we've already seen some early signs of it. There was some recent findings of, I believe research out of Google, but that could be wrong, of discovering new, more efficient ways of doing matrix multiplication that no person had ever thought of, and their AI-based system had come up with a new way of doing matrix math. AlphaFold out of DeepMind is incredibly interesting for figuring out new ways that proteins fold. That's a little less on generating new knowledge, but essentially reproducing what a human processes incredibly efficiently and at scale. So I think that's a really interesting concept of coming up with new tests. But as always with the scientific method, part of this new knowledge discovery is testing that discovery. So that's why you publish the paper and get slings and arrows thrown at it from your colleagues, and to prove that it is right. General relativity is still just a theory that could be proved wrong today, tomorrow, with a different test. All models of the universe, to a certain extent, are wrong. It's just a matter of when they are wrong. How useful is the model? So it would be really cool. I would be excited for the day where AI-based systems can help generate new discoveries that people would not have thought of. At the same time, you can't take new discoveries just at face value and say this is truth. Part of the scientific enterprise that any AI-based system, I believe, should be subjected to as well, as that verification process to prove that it's true.
Yeah, and that I can't remember the name of the system, but the system that beat the high-level Go player, the game of Go.
AlphaGo.
AlphaGo, yeah, you mentioned it.
Yeah.
I thought that was it, but I wasn't sure. For me, it's kind of like an example of a system figuring out a new way to do something that we already do, but do it a little bit better. And I'm thinking, when will we reach the point where the system will say, okay, I just beat your grandmaster at Go, but guess what? I just figured out while I was playing the game, this is the AI speaking, while I was figuring out the game, I just figured out how the game of Go explains superstring theory. And I actually have, to your point that you just made, I actually have a test that you can run over at Lawrence Livermore or wherever, Los Alamos. I have a test you can run, or at the Super Collider. I have a test you can run that will actually prove what I'm saying. That, for me, will be the exciting moment where AI kind of like transcends just being a tool and moves into, oh, wow, okay, this is this is a different planet now. What are the, like, gonna kind of wrap up now? What are your, in your kind of explorations of AI safety, what is it that you think people in Silicon Valley are missing in terms of the way they think about AI?
So I think one of the largest challenges is buying into the hype of that we're going to solve everything with AI tomorrow. The actual first mention of AI that I have ever come across is something as a proposal for a Dartmouth summer research session in 1956. I believe the group was John McCarthy, Marv Minsky, Claude Shannon, that said we should proceed to investigate developing machine systems that can reason and replicate human reasoning, and we believe that significant progress can be made on this in a summer, and have this knocked out. And so we're 70 years later, more or less, and I don't see that being totally knocked out. So I think some of the challenges is, and this gets into the nature of venture capital funding and building new businesses, is buying too much into the hype. And we've seen AI winters before where the hype doesn't pan out, so that there's a lot of pullback of funding and interest. And that's where I think the real challenge is finding those meaningful applications where the AI-based systems can really provide value to people to allow people to work on other tasks. We've seen this, people losing their jobs is always a concern, but the jobs aren't lost, they're changed so much. I mean, it is, and this is why we need to invest in education so people can adapt to those changes. You don't see a lot of, horse-drawn carriage drivers around anymore, but you see a lot more people doing things like this, where we're having conversations around AI safety that we couldn't have had 100 years ago. So technology frees up people to work on other interesting things. So we need to be able to adapt to that. And that's, I think, finding the places where it provides value to allow people to work on more meaningful enterprises is, I think, both the opportunity and where people should be more focused.
Awesome. Last question. You talked about the hype around AI. Let's talk about the negative hype. I don't think, nothing I've looked at on the AI safety, Stanford's AI safety website is in any way associated with kind of like fear mongering or, negative framing. But I'm just curious, like generally from my conversations when I speak with, people in AI, particularly founders, there seems to be a concern that organizations like yours may stoke more fear, even while trying to do good work around safety, may stoke fear. So let's just cut right to the chase. Do you think, not representing, the organization, just on your own, from your technical background as a professional in technology, do you think there is some somewhat near-term issue or safety issue with regard to rogue AI that will impact humanity in a way that, creates some sort of apocalyptic scenario? And I'm not speaking about bias in AI systems that frame things the wrong way, kind of like what you were referring to earlier, or, errors. And no, I'm speaking about society-wide, humanity-changing issues that are often depicted in science fiction films. Do you think that's kind of all just negative hype? And I understand you guys are on a different track, but like, where do you stand on kind of like the most dire, predictions around AI?
So speaking personally, I generally take the view that the technology that we have today is not going to lead to Skynet. It is incredibly impressive. It can solve many problems that we haven't been able to before, but I haven't seen it be able to reason, to have whatever we define as true consciousness, and those types of properties that might lead to the runaway singularity that people talk about. So generally, I think that it is safe in those regards, or at least we don't know how to invent a system that would fulfill those science fiction doomsday apocalypse scenarios. But at the same time, as you mentioned, there are lots of other harms that can come from AI systems. And those, the researchers, the engineers, the founders, we have a responsibility and an obligation to deal with as we deploy these types of systems to do more good than harm.
Well, Duncan Eddy, thank you. That was an amazing answer. I appreciate you joining us. People can find out more about your work regarding AI safety at aisafety.stanford.edu. Do I have that right? Okay. And you guys can check out previous episodes of the 100 Year Podcast at 100year.com. We are on Spotify, Apple Music. If you want to see our pretty faces, we are on YouTube. You can also check out our newsletter, which is 100year.substack.com, where we talk about a lot of these issues around AI and how it's pretty much changing everything. Again, Duncan, I appreciate you joining us. Thank you so much. This was fun, man. I actually would like to have you back. I want to get a little bit even maybe grimier with some of the space stuff and maybe send you some links to a couple of films, have you watch those, and maybe have you unpack those. I think that might be fun.
No, sounds great. Would love to be back. And this was an absolute blast and pleasure discussing this with you. And yeah, always down for some homework and some good new science fiction watching.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. And we will see you guys next time.